Hello, everybody. It's Cameron Goebel here. This is my presentation of my final research paper for Educational Leadership 502 for Dr. Tyson Marsh. I am calling this paper Resisting Performances of Privilege in Non-Formal Learning Spaces, particularly Makerspaces. Here's an example of the non-formal space that I'm involved with. It's a makerspace called QLab. It's here in Albuquerque. Lots and lots of things go on at QLab. We have 3D printing, we have electronics, we have video game design, we have just sort of generally fooling around with interesting stuff. So there's a lot going on at QLab, but there's a lot going on under the surface too. So makerspaces incorporate design thinking, and that actually plays a role in negotiating the formation of gendered identities. It turns out that when you make something, you're actually forming part of your identity as you invest it into whatever it is you're making. And because of that, gender identity is affected as well. For example, here you see a picture at QLab of some girls involved in making electronics. They're actually using LEDs and batteries and hot glue and stuff like that. And they're creating themselves as makers, as part of their identity. And so when young girls construct things at QLab, what they're really doing is constructing themselves as makers. And then they grow up to be women who have constructed themselves as makers. And they know that they can do things like program in Python or handle fire or create weird Mayan sort of headdress things out of electronics. It's just a creative world. And that's the world that we want to cultivate at QLab. But all this gender identity in construction still carries a lot of weight from the culture within which QLab functions. For example, it's pretty much a boys' club. There are some interesting capitals that are being brought in here too. And because QLab is a nonprofit, it specifically has to do with business capitals. And so you start seeing business reflections of makerspaces and gender identities. For example, the first issue of Make magazine, which celebrates the whole maker culture and is really at the forefront of makerspaces in general, has on its back cover an advertisement for a computer component company that features a very sexy robot woman basically hooked up to a power supply ready to be programmed. So we see the intersection of gender identity, capital, and informal education in the community all coming together. So gender performance in the space can get kind of ugly. So here we have a woman who is programming away. Maybe she's making a robot or designing a circuit or doing some art, something like that. And a guy will come up and he'll start hitting on her. And that's very frustrating because it interrupts her work. It recapitulates that whole gender privilege of, hey, I'm here to hit on you. And it basically scares women away from the space. So this is a privileged gender performance in a makerspace. And as it turns out, sexual harassment is oppression. But because sexual harassment is oppression, we might be able to bring some Freirean pedagogy to bear on creating a solution. To understand how this might all work, I turn to the work of Bose Sperry and O'Leary Keeley, who provided a framework about how choices get made by observers on the decision to intervene or not. It has to do with the level of immediacy that they're comfortable responding to and the level of involvement that they're comfortable putting themselves into the situation. I also turned to a pair of researchers in Australia who were looking at the environmental influences on sexual harassment within the workplace for nurses specifically. They discovered a couple of interesting things. The first is that there are several models of understanding sexual harassment. There's biological, there's sociocultural. They found one that stood up really well under scrutiny, especially contemporarily, called the spillover model. And it has to do with traditional roles permeating non-traditional spaces. They also discovered that gender ratio doesn't really matter. If there are more men than women, you're not more likely to have sexual harassment. Interesting. Also, they found that familiarity and social bonding, prior socialization, reduces sexual harassment. And finally, having an active response by people who see themselves as leaders in the space will reduce sexual harassment. What I'm really trying to do with my research is to understand how all these things work so that I can create a toolbox for other makers and other maker spaces, not just tools and, prescriptive posters and programs and that kind of thing, although that might be a little bit part of it to get some inspiration. What I really want to do is to create a toolbox that helps spaces themselves discover what's going on within their space and within their community, find new ways to think about what's happening, find new ways to talk about it dialogically, find new ways to have an impact, and basically find a new way to love what they're there to do again. And as Freire might put it, to love each other through oppression and into a more progressive world. That's where I'm coming from. My name is Cameron Goebel. I'm looking forward to presenting my research to you sometime soon. Thanks.